Hi, welcome to the first lecture today in Soccer 3666. And today I'll be introducing the broad understanding of what we're going to mean by consumerism and consumer culture in the course, and then talking about two key foundational ways of thinking about consumer culture in terms of the Frankfurt School and semiotics. So today's lecture content will be broken up into three parts. As I've kind of explained in one of the recordings about how to study in the course, I'm just going to reiterate that here in the first one of the course overall. I do hope that you have done the reading and looked through the lecture notes first. The way that I would probably think the best way to do the consumption of the course content in this course is to flick through the lecture notes first, and then either listen and or watch the lecture and do the reading, or vice versa. Do the reading and then watch the lecture. Students tend to find either of those options better for the way that they study, so it's not that important. But you'll note that some of the lectures have quite a bit of lecture notes have some kind of reading content in them. So as I deliver the lecture, I won't be going through all that detail. So in some ways, the lecture notes will be quite useful to read through as well, and that to help contextualize the broader content. So that's what I'll be doing throughout the course. There's, in terms of for you to do the content of the course, you need to do the reading each week, read through the lecture notes, and listen or watch the lecture. Okay, so I'll get started. So in terms of part one, I'm just going to talk through some of the kind of very basics of the course, and this is correlates into the introduction and chapter one of the book Consumption in Everyday Life. And some of you who have done Soccer 1010 will kind of be getting a refresher here, because the lecture on consumption in Soccer 1010 covers some of this stuff. So basically the course wants us to think about how the act of consumption and the practice of it has become a key way that we live our lives, a key practice, to the point where many would argue that we're all consumers now. Now, it's important here to think about the idea of consumption, not just as what you eat and drink in terms of what you consume into your body like that. Consumption here, in the terms of the way social theory thinks about it, broadens the definition out, and means that pretty much, the films you watch, the clothes you buy, everything you buy is a form of consumption. But the films, music, and that kind of stuff that you consume and watch and listen to, that's a form of consumption as well. So we're moving on beyond that idea of consumption as just what you eat and drink, and start thinking about how acts of consumption in that broader sense are key to the ways that we construct our self-identities, the way that social identity is constructed, and is essentially one of the key practice that keeps capitalism going in terms of the way market exchange works. So a way of thinking about that is the kind of in terms of the broader scale across the globe. So where Marx originally started talking and thinking about consumption as a mode of production, what we can think about here is also that capitalism is a mode of consumption. And we can see now, across the globe in terms of how consumption is a form of inequality. Obviously, much of the world, in what we call the developing world, there's still problems with things like having no water and food and shelter. And for most of the 20th century, at least, that was kind of how most people in the world would die, related through problems because of those, no clean water, not having enough food and things like that. More recently, it's been argued that maybe more people throughout the world now, particularly in the West, die of overconsumption, of the problems related to eating too much food, the wrong food, and the relations to obesity and heart disease there. So here we can think about consumption at the very base level of what it means to be a human. It really has profound effects on the ways that we live and the ways that we die. So the course starts thinking about human activity, human practice, through the lens of thinking about humans as consumers. And throughout the course, we'll be looking at both the acts of consumption and the processes of consumption. So the acts here are the kind of thing where you go and buy stuff at a shop on your computer, or you go to a gig or whatever. But there's also like a whole realm of processes behind that kind of lead to the product being in the shop and lead to the kind of ways that we think about ourselves, the ways that we construct our identity, and the ways sometimes our identities are constructed for us. So it's the processes here that we're kind of looking at. Throughout the second half of the course in particular, we'll be looking at some of the actual physical understandings of this in terms of global inequality, in terms of waste and climate change and stuff like that. In terms of the acts of consumption at the everyday level, we'll be thinking about how, you know, those kind of social theory and philosophical debates about whether, you know, all acts of consumption and, you know, mean we're mindless dupes, kind of ideologically, you know, buying and selling stuff, or whether they can mean more than that in terms of, you know, the way that we relate to each other through things, and the way that symbols and rituals are kind of the everyday stuff of being a human anyway, and consumption is just kind of a part of those rituals. So throughout the course, we'll be kind of challenging, you know, many established dichotomies, and really kind of, again, trying to do that, make the normal look strange thing. One of the things that I do want to challenge is the key way that humans have thought about in the dominant forms of politics and economics in particular, and that's the idea of Homo economicus. This is the idea that humans are kind of, you know, rational decision-making machines, that they always act in their own self-interest, and that they always act to kind of, you know, pursue profit and, you know, pursue their own needs over others. Bourdieu famously called this an anthropological monster, and, you know, there's an argument that, you know, the very notion of Homo economicus needed to be invented to make classical liberal and what we now call neoliberal economics work. That model of a human really has very little reality and basis in terms of how actually humans act in the day-to-day world. Humans are emotional, they do all kinds of irrational things, and they don't always act selfishly and rationally and for profit. So throughout the course, you know, we'll be challenging that idea and thinking of ways, different theoretical ways to challenge that. And we'll also be thinking, you know, through these kind of opposing dichotomies and how consumption plays a role in kind of thinking about those things. So there's the kind of structure and agency, consciousness and unconsciousness kind of stuff that you would have looked at in other courses. And in this course, we're looking at notions of the savvy and the sucker, notions of control and creativity, you know, the dichotomy between being an alienated being and being free, you know, the same restraint and excess. We'll be looking at the ways that consumer culture and the spectacle of it challenges dichotomies between meaning and spectacle. You know, today I'll be talking a little bit about wants and needs. Later in the course, we'll be looking at the dichotomy that consumer culture depends upon in some ways between separating nature and culture. We'll be thinking about the differences in terms of consumption between the mind and the body, desire and satisfaction. And in the week on McDonaldization, we'll be thinking about notions of fast and slow and the temporality of that. So the course in general will be kind of, in some ways, you know, challenging, drawing upon those dichotomies throughout. The book that the course uses as the key text also, I think, really interestingly draws on some what Patterson calls figures to think about how consumer culture develops the relationship between the individual and the wider world, and in a way tries to in some ways break that dichotomies again by using those figures to point out the complexity of how those things operate. So there's the cyborg, and this kind of is from the work of Donna Haraway in particular. That the figure of the cyborg helps us think about the socially constructed dichotomy between nature and culture. So we'll be looking at that in some depth later in the course. And then there's also these other figures that kind of think about the very nature of what consumption means. There's the kind of idea of the vampire, where this drudgery of every day kind of having to seek out these specific forms of consumption to live and to feel alive. There's the zombie, that kind of figure that's used in movies quite prominently sometimes to criticize consumer culture. You can think of George Romero's Dawn of the Dead in particular here, that, you know, consumers are just kind of, you know, semi-alive, semi-dead kind of figures trudging about, you know, unthinkingly consuming, dehumanized through those processes. Patterson also draws upon the figure of the anorexic or bulimic to think about the way the consumer culture plays off notions of excess and discipline, and the notion of the cannibal, where maybe consumer culture means that human beings end up kind of eating themselves through their own practice. Metaphorically there, right? We're talking about the ways that kind of a consumer culture is unsustainable in terms of the way that it eats up products. So again, these figures will pop up throughout the course, and I think they're interesting ways to think about and think through some of the problems that we're going to look at. So, also in terms of the course called Consumption in Everyday Life, we're going to think here about what everyday life is and what it means. So, everyday life obviously, pertains to those things that we do every day, things we do in routine and frequency, but it's not just a description in that sense. The sociological notion of everyday life wants us to critically engage with it, look beyond the taken for granted, and again, harking back to the kind of Soccer 101 understandings here, to try and make the normal look strange. So rather than just kind of think about things as routine, as normal, as doxic, or things like that, where we don't really challenge that common sense understanding of what we do, the notion of everyday life here is something that needs to be critically engaged with. And those routines, those norms, need to be thought of and thought through in terms of how they're the result of a whole history of decision makings and dialogues and engagement with experts and that kind of thing. But also in the everyday, there's a multiplicity of situations, feelings, effects, and we draw on our ethics and morals and values to kind of participate in day-to-day life. So everyday life here is not just kind of the routine, it's something to kind of think about how the past influences the present, but also in terms of how the future is always kind of present in the way that we practice in everyday moments. We tend to be thinking about how our current choices and practices affect the future. We want our future to be good or satisfying or happy. And so the notion of everyday life is kind of a moment to think about how the past, present and future come together in the way that we practice in day-to-day lives. So this is the kind of notion of everyday life that the course called Consumption in Everyday Life is drawing upon. So you can see in the first couple of chapters this week that consumption has a relatively long history now. I'm going to leave the summaries of Marx and Veblen and Simmel to the reading. But again, like I'm emphasising here, that most of the theory we're drawing upon will be kind of what's seen as the post-cultural turn of about the 50s and 60s, where there was a move away from social theory that tended to focus on the production side of things to start to include the consumption side of things. So in the second half of in the second part of the lecture, I'll be looking at the critical theory from the Frankfurt School that's influenced by Marx, and in the third part, I'll be looking at the notion of semiotics.